A careless mistake on a flight changed everything for one passenger. Little did he know, the man he insulted was Chris Hemsworth, a true hero, both on and off the screen. The flight was smooth, and the mood inside the cabin was calm. It felt like just another ordinary day in the air. In one of the seats by the window, a man sat looking relaxed. He was casually dressed, wearing a hoodie and sunglasses, just like anyone else. He wasn't trying to stand out or draw attention. He was simply enjoying the flight, staring out at the clouds and lost in his thoughts. He looked like an average guy, just another traveler on the plane. What no one knew was that the man sitting quietly by the window was none other than Chris Hemsworth, the famous actor known for playing Thor in the Avengers movies. But at this moment, he wasn't the big Hollywood star that everyone recognized. He was just another person on the plane, blending in like anyone else. Despite his fame, Chris wasn't looking for attention. He wasn't wearing a fancy outfit or acting like a celebrity. He wasn't surrounded by fans or people wanting autographs. Instead, he was enjoying a peaceful moment, just another traveler heading to his destination. As the flight went on, the other passengers were busy with their own lives, reading, sleeping, or staring out at the sky. Nobody noticed the famous actor sitting among them, and Chris seemed perfectly content to remain unnoticed. Little did anyone know, though, that this ordinary flight was about to become anything but ordinary. A few rows ahead of Chris, there was a passenger who wasn't having a good day. From the moment he boarded the flight, things seemed to go wrong. His seat was uncomfortable, and he couldn't seem to get the right position to relax. It was a small problem, but it annoyed him more than it should have. As he settled into his seat, he started feeling even more irritated. The flight had been delayed for a few minutes, and that just added to his bad mood. The man was clearly frustrated. He started shifting in his seat, tapping his foot, and sighing loudly every few minutes. His face showed signs of annoyance as he looked at the other passengers, wondering why no one else seemed bothered by the delay. He felt like he deserved better treatment. After all, he had paid for this flight, and in his mind, he was entitled to the best experience. Soon, he couldn't take it anymore. He raised his voice and started complaining to the flight attendants. "Why is everything so slow? This is ridiculous," he said loudly. The attendants, who were just doing their jobs, tried to stay calm and explain that the delay was out of their control. They were polite and offered him a drink to make him more comfortable, but the man didn't want that. It wasn't enough for him. His complaints grew louder and more frequent. He started to demand better service, his voice echoing through the cabin. "I paid good money for this flight, and I deserve better than this," he shouted. Some of the other passengers began to notice him, glancing over at the source of the noise. But the man didn't care. He was too angry to worry about what other people thought. He began focusing on small things that annoyed him even more. The flight attendants weren't quick enough with his drink. The temperature on the plane wasn't to his liking. He even complained about the noise level in the cabin, though it was just the usual hum of the plane's engines. Everything seemed to irritate him. He wasn't just upset anymore, he was angry, and he wanted everyone to know it. As his complaints continued, the other passengers started shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A few of them tried to avoid eye contact, while others gave him annoyed glances, wishing he would quiet down. But the man didn't stop. His voice became more forceful, and he demanded immediate action. He wanted everything to change, and he wanted it now. In his mind, the world owed him something, and he wasn't going to settle for anything less than perfect. He didn't care who he upset or how loud he had to be. The more the flight attendants tried to calm him down, the angrier he became. It was clear that he wasn't interested in hearing explanations or compromises. He just wanted things to go his way, and if they didn't, he wasn't afraid to make his anger known. The tension in the air grew. The passengers around him started to feel uncomfortable, but none of them dared to speak up. They were all just waiting for the situation to calm down. But the man wasn't done yet. He was determined to make sure that his frustration was heard. The tension in the air was thick as the passenger continued to vent his frustration. His voice echoed through the cabin, and some of the other passengers were starting to feel uncomfortable. Chris Hemsworth, still sitting quietly by the window, hadn't said a word. He was calm and collected, watching the clouds outside, unaware of the drama unfolding around him. The flight attendants did their best to handle the situation, but it seemed like the angry passenger was only getting louder. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the flight attendants made an announcement over the intercom. The man's complaining had reached its peak, and everyone in the cabin was waiting for something to happen. "Ladies and gentlemen," the flight attendant's voice rang out calmly through the cabin, "thank you for your patience. We would like to take a moment to inform you that this private jet is owned by none other than Mr. Chris Hemsworth." The words hung in the air for a brief moment, and then it hit everyone, especially the angry passenger. The moment the flight attendant said Chris Hemsworth's name, the entire cabin fell silent. The passenger, who had been so caught up in his own anger and complaints, suddenly froze. His eyes widened, and his face went pale. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He was still trying to process what he had just heard. He looked around the cabin, scanning the faces of the other passengers, who were now quietly staring at him. Some of them had already figured it out, realizing who the man sitting by the window was. They began to smile, exchanging knowing glances as the realization spread. But for the angry passenger, it was like a punch in the stomach. It was then that he looked back at Chris, who was still sitting calmly by the window, completely unfazed. The man's heart sank as he understood what had happened. He hadn't just been disrespecting some ordinary person, he had disrespected Chris Hemsworth, one of the biggest movie stars in the world. The actor who had played Thor, the mighty superhero from the Avengers movies, the man who was known and loved by millions around the world, was sitting just a few feet away from him. The very same man he had shouted at and even spit on in a moment of anger. The realization hit him hard, he had made a huge mistake, and now there was no way to take it back. The passenger's face flushed red with embarrassment. His earlier anger turned into regret, and he felt his stomach churn with humiliation. He looked down at his hands, feeling the weight of his actions. What was he supposed to do now? How could he apologize to someone like Chris Hemsworth, someone he had wronged in such a public way? For a few moments, he didn't know what to do. The entire situation had changed in the blink of an eye, and he had no idea how to fix it. The moment the realization hit him, the angry passenger's world seemed to stop. He had been yelling, complaining, and even disrespecting Chris Hemsworth without even knowing who he was. Now that he understood the truth, he couldn't believe what he had done. His heart raced, and he felt a deep sense of embarrassment flood over him. The passenger looked at Chris, who was still sitting calmly by the window. Chris hadn't said a word during the entire situation, and he wasn't acting like a celebrity. He didn't look angry or upset, just quietly sitting there, lost in his own thoughts. The more the passenger thought about it, the more regret built up inside him. He had acted so thoughtlessly, and now, he was face to face with the man he had wronged. The flight was still calm, but the atmosphere had completely shifted. The other passengers were watching him closely, waiting to see how he would handle this moment. He knew that everyone was aware of his mistake now. They had all heard the announcement, and they had all seen his outburst. The whole cabin had become a silent witness to his behavior. Swallowing his nerves, the passenger slowly stood up from his seat and made his way towards Chris. His hands were shaking, and he could feel the heat of embarrassment on his face. He wasn't sure how to begin, but he knew he had to do something. He couldn't just sit there and pretend nothing had happened. When he reached Chris, the passenger hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. He took a deep breath and spoke in a voice that was quieter than before, almost apologetic. "Hey, I just want to apologize," he said nervously. I didn't know who you were. I didn't mean to disrespect you like that. I've just been having a really bad day, and I lost my temper. I'm really sorry. Chris didn't immediately respond. He sat there, looking at the passenger with a calm expression. The man's heart was pounding in his chest as he waited for a response, wondering how Chris would react. Would he be angry? Would he yell? The passenger felt like the ground beneath him was shifting, as if he might sink into the floor from shame. Finally, after a brief silence, Chris smiled. It wasn't a smile full of judgment or sarcasm, it was a gentle, understanding smile, the kind that said, "It's okay." Chris looked at the passenger with kindness and said, "It's all right, man. We all have bad days." The words hit the passenger harder than he expected. Chris wasn't angry, he wasn't upset, he was forgiving. His calm and understanding response made the passenger feel both relieved and even more guilty at the same time. Chris didn't hold a grudge. He didn't make the passenger feel worse than he already did. Instead, he gave him a moment of grace, something the passenger hadn't expected at all. Chris didn't treat him like a fan or a celebrity, he treated him like a human being who was just having a tough time. "Really, man," Chris continued, "it happens. No harm done." The passenger, now feeling a little lighter, nodded and muttered, "Thank you. I really didn't mean to, well, you know." He stood there for a moment longer, still feeling embarrassed but also grateful. Chris's simple forgiveness had changed everything, and it made the passenger realize just how much strength it took to be that kind to someone who had wronged you. The passenger, now filled with regret, slowly turned and walked back to his seat. His mind was racing as he tried to understand everything that had just happened. He had been so focused on his own frustration that he hadn't stopped to think about anyone else, let alone the man sitting next to him. He had let his anger get the best of him and had treated Chris Hemsworth with disrespect. But now, after seeing Chris's calm response and kind words, he realized just how wrong he had been. As he sat down in his seat, the weight of his actions hit him even harder. He stared out the window, trying to process everything. How could he have been so careless? What had made him think it was okay to lash out at someone, especially without knowing who they were? The thought of disrespecting someone as kind and patient as Chris made him feel even worse. He had never thought about how his words and actions might affect the other person. He had just wanted to get his frustration off his chest, without any care for the consequences. But now, he understood. The way Chris had handled the situation wasn't just about being polite, it was about showing real strength. Chris hadn't let the man's anger bother him. He hadn't raised his voice or retaliated. Instead, he had stayed calm, showing a level of humility and grace that the passenger had never expected. In that moment, the passenger realized that true strength isn't about fighting back or being tough, it's about showing kindness and understanding, even when it's hard to do. Chris's response had taught him more than he could have imagined. It wasn't about forgiving someone for a mistake, it was about recognizing that everyone has their bad days, and everyone makes mistakes. We all get upset at times, but how we handle those moments is what really matters. The passenger knew that if he wanted to be a better person, he needed to learn how to control his temper, be more understanding, and always treat others with respect, no matter who they are. The flight continued smoothly, but the passenger's mind was still on what had happened. As he thought about Chris, he realized just how lucky he was to have been given a second chance to make things right. Not everyone would have been so forgiving. In fact, most people probably would have gotten angry or even told him off. But Chris hadn't. He had shown him that sometimes, the best way to deal with conflict is to remain calm, stay kind, and understand that everyone is fighting their own battles. Meanwhile, Chris remained completely unaffected by the incident. He continued to relax, enjoying the peaceful flight, looking out the window and listening to his music. To him, the moment had passed, and he had moved on. But the passenger, now filled with a new understanding, couldn't stop thinking about it. He knew he would carry this lesson with him for the rest of his life. As the plane made its way to its destination, the passenger felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt before. He had learned that respect, humility, and kindness were more important than anything else, and he promised himself that he would try to live by that lesson from now on.